Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Jackson School's winter speaker series events at the University of Washington in Seattle. I'd like to begin with our land acknowledgement. At the Jackson School, we acknowledge that we are on Coast Salish territory, the traditional homelands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations and other indigenous peoples. The Jackson School understands that the international community includes sovereign American Indian tribes, First Nations, and indigenous peoples across the world. So I'm delighted to welcome you here today to our next speaker in our series on race, protest, and citizenship across African worlds. This is a series, as many of you who are regulars know, has been organized with the intellectual work and institutional work of our dear friends and partners in the African Studies program. And a big thank you to Danny Hoffman and also to Monica Rojas for all of her work. And in addition, we are very happy to be presenting this series in partnership with the Center for Global Studies, Comparative History of Ideas, Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, the Simpson Center for the Humanities, and the Henry M. Jackson Foundation. In addition, this particular lecture is co-sponsored by the Strom Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Washington. I'd like to begin. Let me just say give you one logistical note. At any time during the talk and event today, feel free to start sending questions in the Q&A box because we accumulate that. So you don't have to wait till our speaker has finished speaking. So with that, I'm delighted today to introduce my colleague Leora Halpern, who is going to be both who's going to both introduce our speaker and also serve as our opening discussant for the session. Leora is Associate Professor of International Studies and History, and she holds the Rebecca and Jack Benaroya Chair in Israel Studies. As most of you probably know, she's a distinguished expert in Israeli history. Her first book, Babel in Zion, Jews, Nationalism, and Language Diversity in Palestine, was published by Yale University Press in 2015 and was awarded the Shapiro Prize from the Association for Israel Studies for the best book in Israel Studies. And I'm delighted to also announce that her new book, The Oldest Guard, Forging the Zionist Settler Past, will soon be out with Stanford University Press. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Leora. Leora, you can take it from here.
Very good. Great. And I'll also ask Efrat to turn on her video so that you can see her as I'm introducing her. Okay. So welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to be here to introduce our speaker today and also to be partnering with the Jackson School on behalf of the UW Israel Studies Program and Strom Center for Jewish Studies to bring Efrat Yerday, who will be sharing her insights about the Ethiopian Jewish community of Israel. Just to put this talk into a larger framework, at a time when our own country is experiencing and addressing issues of racism, nativism, and second-class citizenship, it's important for us to gain perspective from other parts of the world, both in understanding that each country has its own distinct lineages around race and citizenship, but also in recognizing how influential American discourses and practices have been in shaping both ethno-nationalism and the struggles against racism around the world. The United States and its policies around race were shaped by the twin realities of slavery and native dispossession. The Israeli state, though also founded by European settlers, has a very different lineage and self-image. Jews who had experienced persecution as a racialized group of non-Europeans within Europe began to understand themselves as an ethno-national group of their own that, at least in principle, included Jews from all over the world. To this day, the official understanding of Jewishness in the state of Israel is as an ethnic or ethno-religious category and not a racial one. There was a well-known play produced in 1954 and then turned into a movie called Casablanca, which included the famous song, Kulanu Yehudim, We Are All Jews, which showed harmony between Jews of European, Middle Eastern, North African, and Asian backgrounds, all with different clothing and racial appearances, but sharing a Jewish national identity. The immigration of Ethiopian Jews increased rapidly in the 1970s and was assisted by two major Israeli operations, but had actually begun earlier, even under the British, before Israel's independence in 1948. And in theory, this was part of the larger project of ingathering of the exiles, a kind of rainbow of Jewish diversity. And because of this Jewish diversity, Israel has historically been very resistant to racial or racialized criticisms or framings, believing that it was a society not founded on race. At the same time, the structures of racial hierarchy in Europe that had demoted Ashkenazi Jews to a lower level also left their imprint on the Jews who founded the state, who often instinctively regarded non-European Jews, including Middle Eastern and North African, but also Ethiopian Jews, as backwards and in need of civilizing to bring them up into the level of the nation. And many European Jewish elites and government figures used the language of Blackness to reference Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, even before the larger waves of Ethiopian immigration. And this is a good opportunity for me to give a plug for the talk that we'll be hosting on March 11th by Professor Brian Roby from the University of Michigan, who himself does research around the racial rhetoric surrounding Middle Eastern or Mizrahi Jews. Meanwhile, Palestinian Arabs, who had been the decisive majority of the population at the onset of Zionist settlement in the late 19th and early 20th century, often looked very much like Middle Eastern Jews, but were not, of course, Jewish. Unlike non-European Jews, this population was not considered admissible into the Jewish national community at all, right? The assumption is that they belong to an Arab nation located elsewhere. And when some did become citizens in 1948, and many more became a non-citizen labor force after 1967, racial hierarchies also defined expectations and treatment in practice, even if not officially in all cases. This sense of non-Jews not truly fitting in has more recently extended to Israel's treatment of Black African migrants and asylum seekers, not Jews, who have come to Israel via Egypt in large numbers, part of a larger global refugee crisis. Fearing that this group was infiltrators and using that kind of language, the Israeli right has referred to them as people who bring crime and pushed for deportation and harsh policies. So what does this mean for Ethiopian Jews, who are both Black and Jewish? Right? They find themselves at or near the bottom of a de facto but not official intra-Jewish racial hierarchy. At the same time, they're within the Jewish community for whom the state was created, and often very proud of that identity, although historically it has been at times questioned by rabbinical authorities. The story of Ethiopian Jews is so fascinating to me because it shakes up the more familiar categories or oppositions between Israeli and Palestinian, white and non-white, insider and outsider. And it helps us think with more nuance about the boundaries of citizenship and mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion, and sometimes both inclusion and exclusion at the same time. So who better to help us think about this story in this context in historical perspective than Efrat Yerday. Efrat is a PhD candidate in sociology at Tel Aviv University. Her PhD project is called Ethno-National Citizenship and Jewish Illegality, Ethiopian Jews in Israel 1955 to 1975, and the Struggle for Naturalization. She also holds a master's degree in political science and government from Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, and she wrote her master's thesis on foreign relations between Israel and Ethiopia in light of Mashav development programs, Israel's development programs in Africa. In 2012, she established the Ra'av, Hunger, publishing house in the city of Beersheba. And for 2 years, she wrote a column entitled Shachor Mishachor, Blacker Than Black, for HaMakom Achi Cham Begenom, the hottest place in hell, and is a frequent contributor to the Haaretz newspaper. Finally, Efrat is the chairperson of the Association of Ethiopian Jews, as well as an entrepreneur, teacher, writer, and activist. And in 2020, she won the New Israel Fund Guardian of Democracy Gallanter Prize. So I will now turn over the screen to Efrat, and I just want to remind you, if questions come up during the talk, please place them in the question and answer box. You don't have to wait until the end to do that. So with no further ado, I introduce to you Efrat Yerday.
Oh, thank you, Leora, for the brilliant introduction. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak with you today. My research focuses mainly on a group of young Ethiopian Jews who come to Israel in the early 60s to 1975 as tourist and migrant workers who intended to stay and become naturalized. What this research has highlighted, and what I will focus on today, is that the Ethiopian case serves as a unique chapter of Jewish illegality. It has implications for the way we understand the Israeli Jewish citizenship regime, allowing us to see the racialized mechanism underlying the immigration state logic and the centrality of categories of illegality in the making of the migration and citizenship regime. The Ethiopian case shows us how ethno-national and ethno-racial dynamics work in tandem in the constitution of the Israeli citizenship regime. As background, under Israel's law of return, anyone who is Jewish or converts to Judaism can immigrate to Israel and obtain citizenship. The law of return is defined as a natural right bestowed upon the state by the Jewish nation. The ethnic definition of who is a Jew within the state's official discourse is fluid, negotiable, and performative, meaning the examination of who belongs to the ethnic nation as a Jew does not derive from a structured and ordered set of laws, but rather is subject to ideological and political struggles and interests. The mixture of Jewish law and liberal Israeli law creates a gap between the state law of who can be a citizen and the Jewish law of who is a Jew. These differences regarding the definition of who is a Jew in the law of return, as first enacted in 1950, went unresolved for 2 decades, until 1970. But let's recall that Ethiopian Jews have been present in Israel since its establishment. They were not considered Jews by the state, and therefore they were not eligible for Israeli citizenship. The law of return did not apply to them, and they remained illegal residents for many years. Frequently, critics of the Israeli immigration regime emphasize the discriminatory policy that allows naturalization only for Jews. The uniqueness of this case is that the racialized logic operates within the ethno-religious community and not without. My research is based on documentary analysis of Israel's State's Archive, Chezi Ovadia Archives. Ovadia was an Israeli Yemenite Jew born in Eritrea who became Israeli mentor of the first immigrants from Ethiopia. The National Library of Israel and the National Library of Israel. It is also part of a larger research based on other archives in addition to those mentioned, and life narratives interviews with Ethiopian Jews who arrived in Israel between the early 60s until 1975, as well as on their private archives. So let's start with a basic historical question. Who are the Ethiopians? Israel's national historiography highlights the discovery of Ethiopian Jews by explorers such as Yosef Halevi in the late 1860s and Yaakov Feitlovich at the turn of the century, the journey of Ethiopian Jews to Sudan in the late 70s and early 80s, the rescue operation in the 80s and 90s, and in the prominent Israeli leaders such as Rabbi Ovadia Yosef and Prime Minister Menachem Begin. According to the current hegemonic narrative, the historical encounter between Ethiopian Jews and the sovereign entity occurred in November 1984, the year of Operation Moses, when Ethiopian Jews were airlifted from Sudan to Israel. This notion was not the result of a lack of research. On the contrary, Ethiopian Jews are among the most studied communities in Israel. Moreover, scholars have researched the religious and racial origins of Ethiopian Jews long prior to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. One could say that the study of Ethiopian Jews mostly represent the national narrative about this group, and that over the years, scholars have become the producers of this narrative. I want to highlight a different perspective, that Ethiopian Jews were in an ongoing relationship with rabbinical authorities and political and state bureaucrats since 1948. Yet, the Ethiopian Jewish presence in Israel from 1948 and the community's struggle for recognition and citizenship by the state authorities are wholly absent from the prevailing narratives. The national historiographical framing highlights the detachment of Ethiopian Jews from the Jewish diaspora for 2,000 years. This historiographical dynamic is not unique to Ethiopian immigration. According to Amnon Raz-Krakotkin, the Zionist historical consciousness promotes continuity between the ancient past to the modern present, which appears only through the Zionist movement that sees itself as a renewal of ancient Jewish political sovereignty. This consciousness cannot contain the vitality of Jewish diasporic community. The historical record is quite different from this narrative. In the mid-50s, a small group of Ethiopian youth arrived in Israel as part of the Kfar Batya Youth Project, initiated by Yaakov Feitlovich, a Zionist researcher affiliated with the Mizrahi movement and supporter of the Ethiopian Jewish cause. Those who stayed in Israel went through a special conversion process in 1957 in a special court for the conversion of Falasha youth, a special court that was special to this group. As the Ethiopian Jews were called Falashas, that's the name I will use specifically in this period, that the term they were using, which was the only one of its kind in Israel's history. Correspondent on a plan to settle 50 Falasha families in Upper Galilee, in the mid-60s, various departments of the Foreign Affairs Ministry, including Israel's embassy in Addis Ababa, exchanged correspondence on a plan to settle 50 Falasha families in Upper Galilee. The project was archived for political reasons. In a 1966 meeting of the Ministry of Interior, it was decided to extend everybody temporary residency for another year, paying attention to the fact that they are minors. These individuals probably arrived in Israel as minors in the Kfar Batya project and stayed as trespassers and without civic status. Dozens of Ethiopian Jews entered as migrant workers and tourists during these years. Groups that arrived during the early 60s and 70s remained in Israel illegally after visa extensions and expiration. In 1971, a group of 17 Ethiopian elders signed a letter to the chief Sephardic Rabbi Yitzhak Nissim, in which they agreed to accept his spiritual leadership and his authority. The unclear policy and conflicting stances of the authorities can be seen in a 1972 letter from the Israeli embassy in Addis Ababa to the consular department regarding two requests for entry visa. Quote, "Because I suspect that these two are Falashas who intend to stay in Israel, I'm asking for your instructions." Clearly, Ethiopian Jews were not yet coming to Israel under the law of return, and therefore the first step made by some of them toward rejoining with their community was to seek family reunification under Article 7 in the law of entry, which applied to non-Jewish spouses and minors after had they undergone special conversion, what's called in the halachic language, Giyur lechumra, the religious language. This is notable because in 1971 and 1972, the Ministry of Interior issued visa expiry announcement and demanded the immediate departure of several Ethiopian Jews. Some of these people met with Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, the new chief Sephardic rabbi of the State of Israel. And after a correspondence between Rabbi Yosef and Chezi Ovadia, that mentioned before, Rabbi Yosef made the controversial halachic religious ruling in 1973 that Ethiopian Jews are in fact Jews and therefore eligible for the law of return and should be reunited with Israel's people. Quote, The Falashas are Jews that must be saved from assimilation, and there is need to expedite their aliyah, the immigration. I'm certain that the government authorities, the Jewish agency and organization in Israel and the diaspora will assist us in the best ways they can in this holy mission. This is a mitzvah, our religious commitment of saving our brothers. The rule of Rabbi Yosef was contexted by diverse public figures, institutions, and authorities. For example, the parallel Ashkenazi chief rabbi, Shlomo Goren, claimed that the decision about who is a Jew should not be made by individual rabbis, but rather under the authority of the rabbinical council. At the same time, an official from the Ministry of Immigration and Absorption, Professor Yosef Litvak, published the Falashas report known as the Litvak Report. Among his many arguments against the immigration of the Falashas to Israel, genealogical, medical, and social arguments, he stated, quote, even if they will convert under pressure, there is no realistic chance that the religious public in Israel will credit their formal conversion with no reservations and fully integrate socially among them. Moreover, it is unlikely that the secular public will contain people who are culturally strange when the only factor that connects these groups is a common religious belief, end of quote. We should understand that Litvak as a gatekeeper, using every argument he can in order to prevent the recognition and entry of Ethiopian Jews to Israel. Falashas are the only group in the history of the State of Israel who underwent this special conversion path I mentioned before. There is no other collective required to join Judaism in the special conversion framework. Essentially, this would indicate that Ethiopian Jews were simultaneously Jews and non-Jews. Maybe I should mention that special conversion is something specific that's been used toward people that consider to be Jews. So we can talk about it more later. Finally, in April 1975, under government resolution, Ethiopian Jews were eligible for the law of return. 2 years later, in 1977, activists met with Prime Minister Menachem Begin, the same year he was elected in 1977, to convince him to make progress toward mass aliyah, mass immigration. In August of that year, the first legal group of 122 Ethiopians entered Israel through the figurative front door, rather than coming as trespassers. Nonetheless, it seems that until 1979, the Israeli consulate in Ethiopia did not have a clear regulation on visa permits for Ethiopian Jews. Some who applied for visas were rejected even though they were formally eligible to the law of return. And let us recall that Ethiopian Jews who were already living in Israel did not receive citizenship, but only after their conversion in the special conversion path, and it took a long time for the right to citizenship to be recognized. This anomaly embodies the racialization of the citizenship mechanism. First, the rejection of Ethiopian Jews as Jews. Second, the demand for conversion. And third, the hesitation, if not outright denial, of the Rabbanut and Ministry of the Interior to grant the right to citizenship even after conversion. This practice of exclusion shaped the legal status of Ethiopian Jews and their strategies toward recognition and citizenship. Unlike other Jews, Ethiopian Jews entered Israel from the back door as tourists or migrant workers and became infiltrators. However, unlike non-Jewish infiltrators, mostly Palestinians and migrant workers, a few years later, they were accepted to enter through the front door under the law of return. The state reacts to the Ethiopian case as an anomaly. It leaves them outside the tent. On the one hand, the state negotiates with this group as though they are Jews, but on the other hand, prevent them from being Israeli citizens. I want to claim that this is not an anomaly, but part of state logic regarding immigrants who do not conform to the white national character. Israel's certification of citizenship through the definition of who is a Jew interacts with whiteness. The question of who is a Jew is also racialized by its fluid answers and not questioning the racialization of Jewishness itself. Previous studies indicate selective regulation policies are applied to different ethnic groups. For example, differences in quotas, medical test requirements, and the type of documentation proving Jewishness that a potential immigrant is required to submit. I'm referring to the first decades of the State of Israel, first decades of immigration. Most studies on Jewish immigration to Israel focused on the selective immigration and integration policies comparing Western Jews to Eastern Jews. Though these studies indicate discriminatory policies, they do not point to denial of citizenship. When considering the law of return, we should address three layers. First, the normative one, that is, who is a Jew. Second, the law itself and its target audience. And third, the performative role of the potential citizen regarding the law. We'll start with the ideological layer that comes before the law is articulated and which reflects the values of Zionism and the beliefs of the stakeholders involved. The ideology of Zionism is the gathering of the exiles, a safe haven for Jews from around the world based on democratic values. Then comes the legal layer, which is the juridical articulation of the law itself as it applies to its target audience. The establishment of the state cannot be separated from the Holocaust of the Jews of Europe. When bureaucrats and politicians discussed the law of return during the formative period, they did so while imagining the Holocaust of the Jews of Europe. Ethiopian Jews are not part of this image. This image of white Jews is relevant not only for the formative years, but is part of the state logic decades later. We can see how it manifested in the 1970 amendment of the law of return that allowed white non-Jews to be naturalized. Lastly, who is a Jew it should theoretically be based on the ability of an individual to negotiate concerning his Jewish origin. In the case of Ethiopian Jews, however, it was not an individualistic matter, but a collective issue. Ethiopian Jews entered the political community via collective reference. The examination of their Jewishness was not ad hominem, but a collective examination of the community. My research showed that the state negotiates their status as individuals, but individuals who are part of a questionable community. Eventually, their position as illegal residents shaped the struggle for citizenship. Ethiopian Jews encounter a legal conflict based on normative conflict. These conflicts are intertwined, though they are different in how they shape the character of the struggle for recognition and citizenship. Ethiopian Jews present in Israel until 1975 had to confront the state authorities while having vague legal status, deportable and under the threat of different authorities. Due to their un-Jewishness, they had to carry out their political work as infiltrators. Systematic disqualification in this manner is relevant not only to a specific law, but to the ideological state logic and its naturalization mechanism. These deviations from the state logic of the Ethiopian case are part of the state logic. The state considers Ethiopian Jews an anomaly, and therefore they need a unique system of regulations and mechanism to naturalize. The consequences of systematic disqualification will appear in every step of their struggle for recognition and naturalization until they will enter the polity from the front door, meaning from the law of return, and thus dismantling the normative and legal racialization. A particularly striking dynamic characterizes nationalism in Israel. On the one hand, the desire to secure a Jewish majority, and on the other, to give preference to the European identity of immigrants over the Jewish component. It is evident from the 1970 amendment of the law of return, which allowed for the naturalization of immigrants, mostly from the former Soviet Union, who had been considered non-Jews by the earlier definition of the law of 1950. The documents from the Ministry of Interior points out that the reason for this amendment is to allow European non-Jews to naturalize. The nation state is not passive toward the waves of immigration. The state reaction is rooted in a historical, political, and cultural context. The state uses diaspora communities to promote its demographic interests, but notably in opposite ways for immigrants from the former Soviet Union and those from Ethiopia. In the case of immigrants from the Soviet Union, Israel made legal and international efforts to enable their arrival. In contrast, in the case of Ethiopian Jews, despite their continuous presence in Israel, the state prevented and hardened their ability to integrate into the Jewish collective and avoided enacting laws and actions that could allow their immigration until 1977. What I've tried to show in my research is that the state is hesitant toward the containment of Ethiopian Jews into its polity. Since their first encounter with the state, Ethiopian Jews have confronted numerous obstacles before they can enter Israel. These obstacles appear in both in the legal level and the religious level. Most of the stakeholders involved, including the Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Absorption and Immigration, the chief rabbis, both Ashkenazi and Sephardic, the Foreign Affairs Ministry, and even humanitarian and philanthropic Jewish institutions have consented to their questionable status as expressed in diverse practice. These trajectories of Ethiopian Jews to enter the Jewish state may be the basic reason for their anomalous status in contemporary Israeli society. I want to point to announcement of the Rabbanut Council in January 2020, last year, regarding the Jewish status of Ethiopian Jews. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef halakhic ruling from 1973 was only ratified 1 year ago. This is a thought-provoking example of the kind of hesitation and irresolution that is still taking place today. Before we open up the discussion to any questions, I want to share a bit of my personal story. As you may guess, I have a personal connection to the subject matter, but what you heard until now was only my research findings. The materials here are just the beginning of the research. About my personal connection. I was born in Israel in 1981, 11 years after my father's arrival in 1970. He left my mom and 1-year-old baby, my eldest sister, in Ethiopia. In 1971, he got an announcement of visa expiration and that he needs to leave the country immediately. In 1972, he asked for family reunification with his wife and daughter. My mom joined him in 1973 as part of family reunification and not under the law of return. This saga of my mother's journey to Israel after going back and forth from the village in northern Ethiopia to Addis Ababa, distance of hundreds of miles under the Ethiopian government restrictions, and living in Ethiopia under tourist visa is well documented in my mom's memory, as well as in Chezi Ovadia archives and my family private archives. They became activists for the recognition in their Jewishness and the right for citizenship of Ethiopian Jews under the law of return. In 1977, my father became the head of the Association of Ethiopian Jews for a decade, and they had many struggles to come. Most of the archival documents of this association present in Chezi Ovadia's archive, some of them present in Israel State's archives as well. During my studies from the very beginning, I quickly understood that my social experience is a source of endless questions, and that my parents are a source of rich knowledge. These questions and knowledge brought me to the point to research this chapter of history. Thank you all for listening.
All right. Hi there, can folks hear me? Okay. Thank you so much, Efrat, for this fascinating talk. And I also really appreciated how you brought in some of your family story at the end so that we can all understand some of the personal background that brings you to your passion for this topic. I just want to start by posing a few questions that will lead us into our larger question and answer session. What I found really intriguing about your talk was the interaction between secular state officials and religious rabbinical figures. it seemed like sort of the decisive decisions were actually coming from the religious figures in terms of these religious rulings, and yet it was the state officials actually putting the policy into place. And in particular, I'm curious how the religious figures' exclusion is functioning, because it doesn't seem to me that they are thinking, at least explicitly, in terms of whiteness. And so I guess I'm curious, on the religious side, what is their rationale for excluding Ethiopian Jews? But it does seem clearer that the secular state officials had more of this racialized framework, and maybe I'm wrong about that, but I'm curious how these two types of rationales, religious and secular, were working together to create this exclusion, and then later on inclusion. So the second question related to that is the fact that it was the Sephardic chief rabbi who was the one to issue the ruling. You know, I suspect this has something to tell us about Sephardi-Ashkenazi relations in the in this period. I was fascinated by the fact that the ruling included the rationale that the Jews needed to be saved from assimilation, which seemed like a very European Jewish concern that was placed onto this community as a rationale. And then the third question, which is maybe something for another talk entirely, which is whether you can tell us more about the Ethiopian political context that was leading these communities to the decision that they wanted to leave or needed to leave.
So I remember the first question. Maybe you will repeat it later. That's amazing question, because it's really interesting that the Ethiopian case doesn't fit to any clear channel of religious Jewish logic, because and it's also in the context of different political interests. The Yitzhak Nissim chief rabbi, the Sephardic rabbi, before Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, he was against the Aliyah from Ethiopia, and he thought that they are not Jews. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, maybe to put it in political context, was the first Sephardi rabbi who was able to give a fight to the Ashkenazi rabbis, and he was the first Sephardi rabbi that used specifically the Mizrahi Sephardi rules of halacha and questions and answers of Mizrahi and Sephardi traditions, and he was contesting the Ashkenazi rule of halacha by saying that the question of maybe, because the question about the Ethiopian Jews was like, maybe they are mixed with the Gentiles and they are not original Jews and all that. And Rabbi Yosef told him, so why you don't question this? Why you don't ask this question on any other group? Why, when there is a Black community, doesn't use the term Black? Why you ask this question only about Ethiopian Jews? Because we know that this is my adding to that. We know that the Jewish communities all around the world look like the communities they lived in. So Rabbi Yosef also criticized Rabbi Herzog, the first chief rabbi, Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel, that he uses scientific articles in order to claim that Ethiopian Jews are not Jews. And Rabbi Yosef told him, we're not based our religious beliefs and questions and answers and traditions on science. We based it on the Jewish halacha, which is very clear about the Ethiopian Jews, and also one of the main figures, rabbis, that mentions in this long questions and answer in the Jewish halakhic history is Rabbi David ben Zimra, a Egyptian rabbi from the 15th century that already encountered Ethiopian Jews back in this time, and someone from his community told him, can I marry this Ethiopian Jew, and does she a Jew? And this rabbi from Egypt in the 15th century said that they are Jews and they are from the tribe of Dan and all the rest. So Rabbi Yosef based his rule of halacha on this specific, also on this specific Egyptian rabbi, while the Ashkenazi rabbi suddenly decide that maybe this rabbi, the Egyptian rabbi, was wrong, which is something that you usually don't do. Like if you're a religious rabbi, Jewish rabbi, you give a lot of respect to the ancient traditions. So somehow, in the case of Ethiopians, the Ashkenazi rabbis and the rabbis later, until Rabbi Efrat Yerday started to question this ancient rule of halacha. But also we need to remember that the whole problem began only after the establishment of the State of Israel, because different rabbis, Ashkenazi and Sephardi, before the establishment of the state, believed that Ethiopian Jews are Jews. And I'm talking on the early 20th century. Rabbi Azriel Hilzheimer from Germany, Rabbi Cook from Palestine in the 30s. There is question and answers going on. And I think what the problem is, one of the central problem is that when you're trying to take a Jewish tradition that was very vibrant and very related to the local communities, and you put it under a state, under a modern state, it must go wrong. Like, it's very hard to put it under this modern, democratic, national framework. And there are many problems also in different areas. But the thing with Rabbi Yosef is that he was the one also to go to the scientific articles and to criticize the rabbis before him. But this is also connected to your, sorry for the long answer. This is also connected to your context, to your introduction. Rabbi Yosef was the first Sephardic rabbi to give a real space to Mizrahi and Sephardi traditions. Because Rabbi Yitzchak Nissim, for example, the one previous, like, there was a chief Sephardic rabbi, but he didn't have the power. And Rabbi Yosef and the parallel Ashkenazi chief rabbi, they were haters to each other. This is also a context, like I found amazing articles from the newspaper, how they curse each other with religious language. It's very funny. I don't know if you want to go to the second question. I think I don't remember the second question. Sorry.
Well, you mostly answered the second question, which was related to the Sephardi-Ashkenazi relations. The last question was about the context in Ethiopia that was leading them to make the decision to leave.
Ethiopia in the 60s and 70s is under Haile Selassie. It's a monarchy. You are not allowed to leave Ethiopia without visas, like any visa. You need to, that's how people leave. They said they are going to work. And for example, my father got a working visa, and my mom said to the Ethiopian government that she's going to visit her husband in Israel and then to come back. So they were not, during this year, they were not allowed to come to Israel. What happens in the late 70s is that the journey of masses of the Ethiopian Jewish community are doing it under a civil war in Ethiopia. And this is the context of, maybe some of you know, of the refugee camps in Sudan, that all Ethiopians running away from Ethiopia to the borders. And within these Ethiopians, there are also Ethiopian Jews, and they're trying to live as a group to Israel, and that's a long, different story. So this is the Ethiopian context, like the political context.
Thank you, Efrat, for such a really interesting talk. and there's just so much to unpack just in terms of your response to Leora's questions. Some of the questions are building on a particular kind of theme, which is looking at sort of what else is going on in Israel at the time in regard to other communities. And so one question, which actually coming from our colleague Noam, who's a director of the Strom Center, is asking whether the application of the law of return to Ethiopian Jews reflects broader challenges to Israeli citizenship, specifically from Palestinian citizens, and after 1967 in the occupied territories. So, to what extent is that context around Palestinians filtering in, or is it not filtering in to this set of dynamics?
The thing is that in Israel, it's very sophisticated, or it's very not sophisticated. The law of return is relevant only for Jews. There is no law of return to any Palestinian. That's the basic beginning of the state of Israel. Palestinians who get citizenship, they are doing it from the citizenship law, which is different. This is for non-Jews. This was also relevant for Jews who are married to non-Jews, like in the 50s. So the whole what I was trying to say here is that we're always talking about Jews and non-Jews and how it's reacts to Palestinians, that they are indigenous to this land and all that. And I'm saying the Palestinian issue is part of a state logic that enter the religious and Jewish category. It's not separated. This is the same logic, and the law of return. If you can ask who is a Jew, but how you decide on which criteria you decide who is a Jew. So that what I was trying to say is that who is a Jew was relevant to the majority that Israel wanted to have in Israel, because for example, the law of return of the 1950 is only if your mother is Jew. Mm-hmm. And there are different chapters of other things. Mm-hmm. But in 1970, they changed it also to the father and to the grandfather and grandchild. And that's allowed later in the 90s to 350,000 non-Jews by the earlier version of the law. And of course, non-Jews by the halakha, by their religious law, to enter Israel. And this whole change do not relevant to the Ethiopian case, because I'm trying to ask a question is why you decide that there, on which criteria you decide who is a Jew. And criteria are your image about what is Jewishness and how the state of Israel should look like, and who is relevant to this question. So this question never been asked before. Like we always, like the liberal academics as well, they talk about the status of the Palestinians and non-Jews and the illegal residents, migrant workers, and all that. And I want to say that this is that's important, but this is need to be part of a long channel to understand the citizenship regime in Israel and the racialized mechanism of this idea.
Yeah, and I think one of our audience members is saying that, just commenting, it's not a question, that what you're doing is unsettling hegemonic narratives on Israeli citizenship and diasporic Jewish communities. And our colleague is thanking you for that, because it's a very profound unsettling. So just building on that a little bit, one of our colleagues is also asking if you encountered any similarities between other non-European Jewish communities, for example, Jews from India or South Asia, in their efforts to seek Israeli citizenship, so do you have any sort of comparative racial logics, is I think what he's asking.
Thank you so much for this question, because the closest community to the Ethiopian case is the Indian community. I'm talking about after the establishment of the state. The Indian community from India, and specific groups that is called the Bnei Israel. And that's really bothering, that there is nothing written in like academic articles about this story, because they're going like on a parallel line. But the thing with the Indian community is that the rabbinic authorities decided not to tell them to go through a special conversion path as a group. The rabbinical council decided that if they will marry each other, we don't care, that's okay. But in the moment they will marry one of Israel's people, which is not part of the community, they will have to go through kind of conversion. So the Indian community is amazing example of this racialized way of thinking of the rabbis. But they didn't have the government allowed them to come by the law of return from the beginning, and they were eligible for the law of return. They didn't have the struggle for citizenship, but the Rabbanut had to put specific regulations when they are married. If, like you, I guess some of you are not, or most of you are not familiar with the Jewish law, but the thing of the Jewish law is that you're supposed to marry only Jewish people. And when you're, so when the Rabbanut say, if they are married someone outside of the Indian community, they will go through a conversion. So that's, I hope there will be an academic that will do this research, but it's very similar, but the choices of the rabbis are a bit different.
That's really interesting. And it's actually connecting to another question, which is, it's a big question, but it's sort of trying to think through all that you're asking us, you're provoking us to reflect on, which is that your argument, this our colleague says, implies that Jewish should not be understood as narrowly a category of religion, but a combination of ethnicity and nationality. And they're asking, can you elaborate on how this affects the understanding of Judaism that is not Euro/American centric, if that makes sense? So, because it seems like you're, unpacking the idea of religion in relationship to these other logics of race, nationalism.
This is something, how can I say it? This is the problem of the state of Israel. This is a Jewish state. This is the whole thing, like the idea of Jewish state and the status of the halachic law and the court, the legal law, the liberal democratic law. They are in the same level, so they are always conflicting. So that is how, like, also in my research, I see that there are so many opinions and attitudes, and it also doesn't go. It's weird because in the end, the religious side was the supporter of the Ethiopian cause, and the democratic liberal side was against. Like also the Ministry of Interior and actually he was also a religious from the Mafdal party. And the religious were always keeping the Interior Ministry for themselves. And he really fought against the recognition of citizenship for Ethiopians. So it's really complex. It's complex. I need to figure out how to have this map, especially when it doesn't fit to what we know generally, like what the state thinks about Palestinians, what the state thinks about Mizrahi. This is something that is very basic. Citizenship is the right for rights. So I think this is an interesting point to point out on the state logic itself, and it's I want to say it doesn't make any sense, but it's a complex. It's a complex.
Yeah, because religion is being transformed by its new relationship with modern statehood, I think, and so then it's having all of these different implications. And so some of the questions are going to go back to that, but I want to just turn to a new set of questions, which want to know a little bit more. I'm just getting a check. So I'm getting a feedback from one audience member that they're having a little bit of trouble hearing Efrat through her mic. I'm not having any trouble. So if anyone else is having trouble, just put a note in the Q&A and we'll see if we can figure out what to do. But for now, I'm hearing you okay. So we'll just continue with the questions. So there are a number of questions which are asking a little bit more about what is actually happening with immigrant Ethiopians within Israel, in terms of their experiences, their identity. So one question is whether your research looked at how immigrants' Ethiopian background led them to react to Israeli society and government in distinctive ways. So
Sorry, I wasn't, can you repeat again?
Yes. Did your research look at how the immigrants' Ethiopian background led them to react to Israeli society and government in distinctive ways? So how did the experience, the identity, the political backgrounds, etc., of immigrant Ethiopians shape their responses to these laws, to society, to the Israeli state? So what was that? The other side of the dynamic, I think, is what he's asking.
Yeah, I think that when it's hard to, like, I find out like many times that people see Black community in Israel and it immediately goes to the frame of the American way of thinking about Black and white.
Mm-hmm.
There are similarities, but there are deep differences as well, because when Ethiopians want to arrive to Israel, this is the promised land. They go to the Holy Land. And when they come here, and what I understand from the beginning of my interviews, they feel betrayed by their brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
This is how they come to Israel. And when they accept the spiritual leadership and all the rest, they say this is Judaism. This is Judaism, and we want to come back to our ancient homeland.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the way of thinking. And like, I remember I asked my mom, did you know what's going on in the United States? like the civil rights movement, maybe Nelson Mandela later. And she told me that she thinks that she didn't know about it. They know something very general. And she told me that I'm actually, I'm glad we didn't know. Like, we didn't know that this is how Black people are being treated in America, because when my parents, like, where my parents grew up is like, Ethiopia, it's a country that sees itself as civilization. It's have a pride is a central thing to Ethiopian people.
Right.
So I also realized that their chutzpah, their attitude toward the authorities, to go to the prime minister and tell him, if you don't bring Ethiopian Jews to Israel, we're going to demonstrate, and you will be ashamed in the whole world will see that you don't bring Ethiopian Jews from Ethiopia. This is something very radical. And I think it comes also from where they came from. Like they saw themselves as people that have this, also the Jewish side, but also the Ethiopian side of being proud and being uncolonized and have like culture and all that. So it's not like, again, when I'm trying to put them in the right, left wing and all that, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. They come from different political context, and there are some also in Israel. There are a lot of supporters, Israeli white supporters, and there are also things that I didn't have time to show you, but there is a very um, um, unclear connection between the new immigrants with like illegal residents that are studying Hebrew in Ulpan, in a Hebrew class in kibbutz, in kibbutzim, and they don't have ID. And the kibbutzim are accepting them, and they stay there like other new immigrants or Jews that want to study Hebrew and work in the kibbutz. They stay for 3 months and they go to another kibbutz. So there is a whole network that I still need to figure out like how it works. So there are also the supporters, and there are also the people that cannot imagine this group being part of the Israel people. But I think the more interesting thing is even not the the Israeli general public, but the authorities. This is what I'm interested in.
Yeah. So that's really interesting, and it's connecting to a couple of questions. And this is a little bit less about the state side, the Israeli government side, but it's more about, again, fleshing out some of the comments you're making about the immigrant experience, because it sounds to me like you're saying that in terms of the generation of immigrants you're studying, that they experienced this as a kind of religious betrayal. They weren't using the racial logics of the US or the civil rights movement. And they had their own terms. And so we have to be careful of not transplanting race from the US when we understand how they were framing their political activism and their sort of protests with the Israeli government. And I guess a couple of questions are asking whether there's a generational change. So, for example, for young Ethiopian Jews who have grown up in Israel, do they similarly have that? Are they if they're fighting for rights, are they fighting for rights based on religion, or is there an evolving discourse on race that is different from the period you're discussing? I don't know if this is making sense.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
There are like there is the aspect of what you're fighting for. Like fighting for citizenship is very different from fighting against police brutality. Like this is different positions. Like I'm in Israel, I'm Israeli, and I have the right to anything, to everything that everyone else. But they were in this period of time that I'm researching in a very different position.
Yeah.
So I think they were like didn't have many opportunities to demand from the state than I have today. Like this is a totally different level. I'm from a level of Israeli citizen. So it's a bit different, but also you see today into contemporary Israel and the Ethiopian Israelis today, there is a conflict within the community. Like what is more important, like to talk about like we're treated in a bad way because we are Black, or we're treated in a bad way because the religious question. So this is something unsolved, and there are people that will also claim that we shouldn't go to the race issue because this is not the issue. The issue is our questionable status as Jews. But what I will say, of course, that this is something that you can't separate. It goes together. It's intertwined. So you see, like I think that in the last few years, there are more and more, mostly students, academics, artists that speak the language of Blackness and whiteness, and I see it in art a lot. Um, so it's a bit, there is more, like there is the conservative attitude of we're part of Israel's and we need to fix that within this framework. And there is the more, I don't know if to call it liberal or more universal language of this is the same, we're black in white spaces. And that's why we are encountering this police brutality and discrimination in employment and all these things that we know from all over the world.
Just to wrap up this line of questions, there's one last question on this, and then I'll move on, which is, has there been an impact of the Black Lives Matter movement from the US, or is it more, I'm assuming it's more complicated than that, but how is that intersected with what's happening?
I think it's connected to the previous question. Like some people, there is also the Israeli context because Black Lives Matter is, I will flatten it. They are pro-Palestinian, so they're against us. So you need to somehow to be apologetic when you are connected to this kind of group. I can give you like an example from a 2015 demonstration of Ethiopian Israeli against police brutality. There was a video of police officers beating an Israeli Ethiopian in IDF uniform. And that was the most hurtful thing that you can do. Like Ethiopian with uniform of IDF get beaten by police officers. Yeah. So there was a huge demonstration in 2015, and the parliament member Ayman Odeh from the Joint List joined the marchers to march with them, and there was a conflict between the demonstrators, like should he be here? Like if we want the legitimacy from the Israeli public and the people who listen to us, we shouldn't support his marching with us. Like we don't want to be related to it. Mm-hmm. But there was another group that said that, but Palestinians are the obvious the group that are suffering the most from police brutality and IDF and all that. So this is an ongoing discussion that's taking place.
That's really interesting, and it just shows the complexities, ideological also complexities within the community. So I wanted to shift a little bit. We have some questions which want to step back and ask you more about the scholarly impact of your work, because you framed your talk also in relationship to that. So one question from one of our colleagues is, she says that she was struck by something you said early in your talk about Ethiopian Jews being one of the most studied groups of Jews since the 19th century, and the centrality of scholars to producing narratives about Ethiopian Jews. And she's asking, how does your attention to the period 1955 to 75 reshape those scholar-generated narratives? How did or did not scholars participate in the discussions in this period? So kind of your talk is already complicated, but scholarly work, it seems, is part of this process of constructing religion, which you're also unsettling. So, feel free to just dive in any part of that.
I like this question. Really, the researchers that worked on the Ethiopian community, they are what we call recruited researchers. Mm-hmm. Like these are people that do research for the Ministry of Observation. These are the same people that did the research on the Moroccans and the Tunisian in the 40s and 50s that claim that they have cognitive problems and they have like different problems with thinking and these kind of things. So the researchers, that most of the research on the Ethiopian community is about their origins, like are they a converted Ethiopian group that converted from Christianity to Judaism? And this one of the main claims of the rabbi, the Ashkenazi first rabbi, that say that they are not genealogically Jews, which is already the idea that our days historians that research religions in Ethiopia prove that Ethiopian Jews are not genealogically part of the Jewish people. This is a striking way of thinking, and that's really like claims that researchers did in regard to the Ethiopian community, that they are not originally Jews. So, and the other side of it is the anthropological folklore, like what they eat, what they drink, how they talk, like classical classics of like what you can, I guess, some of you read in maths in a critic way, like in African studies, like. There are few researchers that are, I would say cynically, my favorite research on Ethiopian Jews. That's really like the anthropology. It's you feel, you read it and you feel it's like written 100 years ago and not 20 years. So mostly anthropology, folklore, and this is also that, like, I feel that I have a treasure here, because nothing political has been written on this community. Like today, we can see more, but not in this way. And also when I say the producers of the narrative, I'm talking about like the conservative side, like people that believe that they should help the Ministry of Immigration and Absorption to do a better integration process. So they write a research on the community, and should they live in the periphery, and should they be separated in class, and all these kind of things. So this is one line, but the other line is the liberal, the universal, like thinking about on Israel in a democratic liberal values, and they didn't touch this subject at all. Right. So the whole thing, it's about Palestinians and non-Jews, this kind of. But this is also, you see it on Mizrahi research, like the most of the critical research on Mizrahi immigration. Yeah, this is the Mizrahi professors of today that been working on like since the 80s, 90s. So we have here a gap. There is, maybe I should say, there is a, without telling too much of it, but there is a Yemenite children affair, an affair of missing children in the 50s. And this is a whole serious thing in Israel. And there is no one research on this affair in Israel. This is amazing. This is unbelievable, and that subject, it's been for decades, and people are still demonstrating on this thing, like the fourth and fifth generation of these families. And only in the last few years there are serious research about it, and again, not of Yemenite and Mizrahi researchers. That's quite striking for me.
It's really interesting. I mean, there's a whole sociology of knowledge dimension to what you're doing. So just building on that, one of our colleague, Danny Hoffman, wanted to flesh that out more. And he's asking about the different types of archives you're using, private, public, and oral history. And he's asking, what are some of the insights to be gained and some of the challenges you faced in working and interviewing these kinds of different kinds of archives?
Yeah. This is maybe related to one of the questions before about the Ethiopian side of the story. So the people that arrived during this time, they didn't have, I don't know what they used to use back then, fax or all this technology of connections. So that's why I'm starting from the documents, the documents of the State of Israel. The Israel State's archives is the archives of all the ministries and everything that is not censored. And Chezi Ovadia as well, there are technological problems. I had to connect to the daughter of Chazi Ovadia in order to have all the data, because they did a very problematic website of the archives. So now everything is digitized. When I'm talking about the private archives, I'm talking of on the, like, some of my interviewees had like the laissez-passer, the passport, and the document they had from the Ethiopian lawyer that lied to the Ministry of Interior there to give an ID to someone that is underage, like all this journey and stories of like private stories that no one really, these people, like, they're not famous or something like that. They don't give interviews all the time. And maybe my father a bit. But many of them, no one never asked them about this period of time. And what is challenging is that they didn't have all the means to that the state have, and this is a serious gap. But the Association of Ethiopian Jews that established in the early 70s actually have a lot of materials that I find a way to have the whole database. So yeah, I hope I answered the question. You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, you did answer. And this is a comment from our colleague in the Strom Center in Jackson School, Mika Ahuvia. And she's saying, this is just interesting for you. We have a UW grad student who worked on the Yemenite baby affair. So that, I think that would be interesting for you to connect with Mika maybe and follow up on that. And then just, this has been such a rich talk. Lots of questions have been piling up, but we're getting to the last 10 minutes or so. And I wanted to just, we have one final sort of detailed question, which is asking about some of the rural and urban differences amongst Ethiopian Jews. So rural and urban differences within Ethiopia, and how that kind of like translated or within their positions towards the government or within Israeli society. So so the kind of like disentangling differences between Ethiopian Jews, depending on where their origins were within Ethiopia.
Yeah, I think I can say it's not the accurate percent, but more than 90% of the Ethiopian Jewish community that arrived in Israel until the 90s used to live in rural areas. But the people that I'm interviewing are people who mostly left the village and went to the capital city or Addis Ababa or Asmera and had to stay there in order to get a visa. So they work there, they have connection with someone who connected to someone from the village. So their experience, mostly they're from the village, but their experience of urban life is already happening during their journey. So yeah, and yeah, that's a whole story. But this is how they also come to Israel after being in the big city and everything. But most of the Ethiopian Jewish community is coming from until the people that come until the 90s, because there is a whole different community that come later on and still today. They are coming from the rural areas.
Yeah. So and now I'm just curious. This is just for me. So would they have been experiencing a certain kind of marginality, I would imagine, within Ethiopia? And so they're looking at Israel as kind of like as this future, this promise. And then I'm just thinking just in terms of identity formation, if, in terms of, yeah.
Yeah, the Ethiopian Jewish community in Ethiopia, again, this is a question of how we frame it. There is no connection between the pogroms of Europe to the anti-Semitism of Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Totally different, totally, really different. But they were marginalized as Jews. So, but Ethiopia, it's a federation. So during the monarchy time, there are some areas like northern Ethiopia was more liberal toward being a landowner, but the other area, like in Gondar area, where the Amhara area, where most of the Ethiopian Jews came from, they were not allowed to have land because they are Jews. But something interesting happened after there is a coup d'état, the revolution in Ethiopia in 1974. They changed the whole system of lands, that anyone can be the owner of the land because all the lands belong to the nation and all that. So it's somehow the Ethiopian Jew situation got better, but not really, because it was a dictatorship and a very bloody dictatorship. So, but yeah, they, of course they were marginalized, but and they were also very different from the Christian community. They have like very restrict religious rules that are much more radical than the Jewish law, because they were not connected to the halachaic development of other communities. So they were very restrict, in regarding to how to be separated from non-Jews, and not to eat not kosher. So not to eat kosher, so you don't touch anything when you do of like bottles and like everything in like someone's else house, or these kind of things. But it's different from in different areas of Ethiopia. So some people can. I have a friend that she remember when she was young, and she would go to school, and they would throw stones on her because she was Jew. But from like my parents, I never heard this kind of like stories. But she's from Amhara, Gondar, and maybe they're like, I'm not. It's not my field, but from my knowledge, it's a bit different from different areas in Ethiopia. And of course, as Jews, they were separated also, like in their holidays and keeping the Shabbat and all that. So they were different from their neighbors.
That's really interesting. And I think what your talk is also showing us is how much more research is needed um, to flesh out all of these different angles. So we only have a couple of minutes left, and I would just like to close by asking you, where is this project leading you next? Because you've opened up so many questions at so many levels, and I'm wondering, so I know you already have your hands full with this one, but are you thinking about, new directions? Are you thinking about, where this is leading you? Or so this is just kind of a sort of summing up, just to know your trajectory.
Yeah, I think that this is, I can think about something further right now.
Yeah.
That's a handful of directions. And I think it's very, how you say, um, it's very radical, like I'm not trying to, it's my English is not so, but this is something that is challenging, like the basic of the really basics of the Israeli state. So, and also, yeah, I forgot to say before, like someone asked a question about the Ethiopian Israeli community today. And most of the Israeli Ethiopian young people today don't know nothing from what I said today. Like what we learn in school and what you see on the media is that the Israeli state saved Ethiopian Jews from hunger and persecution. This is the story. And this is actually, as the chairperson of the Association of Ethiopian Jews today, I found out like many years ago when I was a spokesperson of the organization that the Ministry of Education want to have a studying program to study about the Ethiopian Jews and their Aliyah, and it was, wow, it was so patronizing and so like putting the state of Israel not even in the middle, in the top of the story. Like, so this is something that's still going on today, and it's very like the scholarship and the political and the personal is very connected and is still going on. This question of who is a Jew, there was a couple weeks ago, and a guy from Uganda that claimed that he is a Jew, and he converted, and the Ministry of Interior did not allow him to get an ID. So this is something that's still going on today, yeah, I cannot think about another project.
No, you definitely have your hands full, and Efrat, it's so clear that your work it's not just rich, but it's so profoundly impactful. And I'm just really delighted that you have been with us today. I wish you had were here in Seattle in person, but we'll have to follow up and find a way to get you here. So let me just end by thanking you so much. I know from the audience comments, which I'm reading out, that there's lots of praise which has been laced throughout the questions. It has just been incredibly interesting and insightful talk. And I think you also, what you're doing, you're challenging understandings clearly within Israel, but I think you're also making US audiences think about questions of race and citizenship in ways which are less US centric, because a lot of times, we assume everybody has, one focal point in terms of racial justice. And I think this has been very, very insightful. So let me end by thanking you. So we will go off screen, and you won't pop up again with me. So this is my closing thank you to you. And hopefully we'll see each other in person in the future.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great.
Yeah, take care.
Thank you.